From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me today is Wijnie De Groot, who teaches Dutch at Columbia University. In this conversation, we speak about how the Dutch 17th century and the powerful reach of the Dutch East India Company has had an enduring yet often unrecognized influence on our modern, interconnected world. We'll discuss how she teaches a class on reading documents from this time, which is a skill that few possess, despite the existence of an expansive archive of written and printed materials. We'll also talk about the status of the Dutch language today. Here's my conversation with Wijnie De Groot. Wijnie, thank you so much for joining me today to speak about Dutch. So I wanted to just first start by asking you to introduce yourself, because every time I try to say your name, I totally screw it up. So could you say your name as you would natively say it, and then also
Yes,
what you teach?
Yes. So my name is difficult because the spelling is difficult for Americans or for English speakers. But in the Netherlands, it's also quite an unusual name, although it's a very Dutch name, and it's pronounced Wijnie. But you write it with a W and an IJ, so people say Wijnie, and they say Wijnie, and all kinds of variations I've encountered. But it's pronounced Wijnie, and I teach Dutch here at Columbia.
And how do you pronounce your last name?
De Groot.
Okay.
De Groot. So the double O is an O, O-A. You sometimes see the name Americanized in spelling like O-A because that reflects the pronunciation. I've seen that.
Got it. So where did you grow up?
I was born and grew up in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I lived there pretty much until I came to the United States. Went to school there, went to university there. And it's my hometown.
So you lived there until the age of 23, 24?
No longer. I lived there until 28 probably, something like that, 29 when I came here.
So you had a full adult life really there before you, because some people that I've spoken with, they come when they're 20, 22 to the US, and so they have this kind of hybrid identity. But it seems like you were a fully formed adult, and then you came to the United States.
Fully formed adults, yes, in certain ways, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you grew up, you went to school and you were speaking Dutch, right?
Correct.
And can you talk a little bit about other languages that you might have learned or spoken at that time?
Yeah, so when I grew up in the Netherlands, the school system was, I don't know if it's still like that, but we had to learn multiple other languages because, of course, Dutch is not a commonly spoken language, and we're surrounded by countries where other languages are spoken. So in school, we started with English. That was in the first grade of high school. High school starts when you're 12. There's no middle school in the Netherlands. So you go to elementary school until you're 12, and then you go to high school. So English and German and French, those were required. And then I went to a type of high school, a more classical high school, where we also had to learn Latin and ancient Greek.
So having studied English from a very early age, I guess when you came to the US, you found it no problem to communicate. How would you describe the level of English that you learned growing up?
I think my English was good enough, and I could speak and understand. I think what was difficult for me was the typical New York accent, because, of course, I wasn't used to that at all. And I found that people found my accent to be sometimes difficult to understand. And even now, that sometimes happens.
No.
So, yeah, I think that was, and of course, certain words and expressions that I never learned in school because we learned British English, of course.
Right. Oh, okay.
And not American English. And nowadays, for young people who go to school, it's really American English that they want to speak and want to learn and want to know. And it's, of course, influence of media and TV and stuff like that.
Right,
Movies.
so that's changed.
Yes, that I think you can fairly say that changed from when I went to school, which is a long time ago.
So when you were growing up, I've been to Amsterdam. I've walked around. It's a beautiful, picturesque city, and I can only imagine what it must have been like to be a child in that setting. Were you living in the city center? Were you living outside?
My family, we lived right outside of the city center, and of course, as a child, you just don't notice the beauty of a city or that this is a city that tourists want to come to because it's just,
It's just where you grew
it's
up.
just where you grow up.
Yeah. So was it a kind of apartment building type?
Yes, we lived in an apartment building, and that's very common in the Netherlands because it's such a densely populated country that single family homes, you don't find that in cities. It's always apartments and apartment buildings. But the apartment buildings are quite low, like 4 stories maybe. And I mean, more modern buildings might be taller, but the one I grew up in was an apartment building from the 1930s maybe, and it was 4 stories. So that's where I grew up.
So as you're growing up, what is the linguistic picture with Dutch in the sense that is the way that you speak Dutch with your friends or in domestic or social settings, is it different in any way from the Dutch that you might learn at school? Or is it the same?
No, it is the same. There are dialects, of course, in the country, and there are also the way people speak in the cities, which is different. I don't know if you can call that a dialect. But the standard Dutch is what I grew up with and what my friends spoke and what we speak in school. But there are regional differences, of course.
So you grew up speaking Dutch and now you're teaching Dutch. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Dutch as a language. What kind of language is it? Where is it spoken? Who speaks Dutch? That kind of thing.
It is a West Germanic language. It's closely related to German, but it's very distinct from German. And it is spoken by about 23 million people worldwide as a mother tongue, as a native language. And that is primarily in the Netherlands, Flanders, parts of Belgium. And it is also the official language of Suriname, not the only official language. Sranan-Tongo is another official language there. And in some parts of the Caribbean, St. Martin, Aruba, it's still one of the official languages in those countries.
Another language, I think it's interesting because Dutch, as it's situated in Europe, it has so much contact with other languages. And another language that is commonly mentioned when speaking about Dutch is Flemish.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people might not be totally clear on the difference between Dutch and Flemish. Can you talk about that distinction, the difference between Flemish and Dutch?
Many people think that Flemish is a different language from Dutch. I hear that a lot. But Flemish, it's spoken in the northern part of Belgium. The other language is French and to a lesser extent German in the east. Those are the official languages in Belgium. But the Dutch that is spoken in Flanders, they themselves, the Belgians, refer to it as Dutch. And it's a southern Dutch, and we speak a northern Dutch. And what they call Flemish is more the dialectic form that they speak among themselves at home. But the standard language they call Dutch. And someone once asked me, but isn't it insulting to them that you call their language Dutch as if it's, as if you, the Dutch, appropriate this country? But it's not. It's the name of the language.
Right.
And
okay.
the fact that the country is called Netherlands
Mm-hmm.
and the language is called Nederlands, and the country is called Nederland. But there's also Belgium, and it's also called Netherlands. And in Suriname, it's also called Netherlands.
So are these different varieties of the same language? How do they differ?
There are different varieties of the same language. They're both called Dutch. And it's a little bit like the difference between American or Australian English and British English. It's the same language. It's all English, but the pronunciation is different. There are different words that you don't have in each other language, in each other's language. So that is really the difference between what some people call Flemish, so the southern variety and the northern variety. Same language, different vocabulary sometimes, and certainly a very different pronunciation. When a person from Flanders says one word, I know immediately you're from Flanders. And vice versa. When I say one word, they say, oh, you're from the north.
A related point and related to what you were just saying, I've noticed that people always say like the Low Countries or the Netherlands, and it's always in the plural. Why is that?
Yeah, I think it is because historically it refers to literally the Low Countries, what we call now Belgium and even Luxembourg, and what is now the Netherlands. But in the Netherlands itself, the country is referred to as Nederland, which is in singular form.
Yeah.
But in German, the Nederlanden, in French, Pays-Bas, in Spanish, in all these languages, it is, and the Netherlands, in English, it is a plural. And that's because of this entire territory of Low Countries that are now separate and have been together and then separate and together again throughout history. Another thing is that people ask me very often, what is the country called? Netherlands or Holland? And because many people call it Holland. I very often do, although that is not the official name. It is called the Netherlands. And actually, a couple of years ago, the government pronounced that the official name, and Holland should not be used by the Dutch Tourist Board anymore. And because Holland is really the two western provinces of the Netherlands. They're called Noord-Holland and Zuid-Holland, North and South Holland. And they're just provinces.
Yeah.
But because that was a very economically powerful part of the Netherlands in the 17th century, that became the name of the country abroad in other countries.
Right.
And they adopted that.
So let's talk a little bit about when you were 28 and you decided to come to the United States. What brought you to the United States? Why did you decide to?
Well, my husband is American. He is from an Irish-American family, grew up in the Bronx. I met him in Amsterdam. And then at some point, I decided to come here and join him.
Oh, wow. All right. And were you coming also with a job in mind, or were you just saying, I'm going to move to be with my husband?
The latter. But I came on a visa, a little-known visa called a fiancé visa. And the advantage is that you get the work permit straight away. The disadvantage is that you have to get married within 3 months. And I did find a job straight away at a translation agency in Midtown. And I did translation work and editing work and stuff like that. And then I gradually started to become a teacher.
What was your impression when you first came to New York City? Did it seem very different from Amsterdam? Was there a lot of similarity?
Yeah, very different. And we're talking now about New York in the 80s, so it's not the New York that we know now. I had no idea about New York. I'd never been to the United States. I heard all these crazy stories about New York. You have to be so careful. Everybody is out to get you. So I was petrified when I came here. But then, of course, it turned out to be quite different than what I feared it would be. And, of course, I love New York now.
Yeah.
And it's my second city.
Now, I live a little bit to the north of New York City. And there's an area right by where I live called Spuytenduyvil, which is a very strange word. And I have heard it is a Dutch-originated word.
Yeah. So there's a lot of Dutch words in geographical terms in New York and around New York. Spuytenduyvil is one, right, in the Hudson River. And when you go more upstate, you will find a lot of place names that end in kill, Catskill, the Catskills, Peekskill, Fishkill, and there's a couple more. And kill is an old, it's not really used anymore in modern Dutch, but it's an old word that means stream.
Oh, okay.
So water. So that's what that Fishkill, of course, everybody thinks, oh my God, what a terrible name to kill fish there. So, but in reality, that's what it refers to. And then within New York, there's so many Dutch words. Staten Island comes from the Staten-Generaal, the States General, was named by the Dutch when New Netherland was founded as a colony they named different locations in the area, and that was named after the States General, who actually funded exploration trips. And Coney Island literally means rabbit island.
Oh, wow.
Because Coney is a corruption of the word konijn in Dutch, and konijn is a rabbit, so there were probably a lot of rabbits when they explored that area. And there's so many, Haarlem, of course, and Flushing is a Dutch word. And some are Dutch words, other are Dutch place names, like Haarlem and Flushing, Vlissingen in the Netherlands. And the Bowery street names are originally Dutch names. So yeah, there's a lot. And Dutch words also. The word stoep is something that is, I think, particular to New York, I always hear. And the word stoep, which refers to like in front of a brownstone, for instance,
sitting on the
right?
stoop.
Where you're sitting on the stoop, but that's a Dutch word. Stoep is a sidewalk in Dutch.
Oh, really?
And the word Yankees is actually Dutch as well.
What does that mean?
Yankee is, they say, a corruption of the word Jan Kees, which is first name in Dutch.
Okay.
And I've read, I don't know this for sure, but that the English kind of made fun of all these Jan Kees, and then that got corrupted to Yankee when the English took over.
The Dutch were in the New World in the 1600s, and they founded a colony that was called New Amsterdam, and that eventually became New York.
It started in 1609 when Henry Hudson was hired by the East Indies Company to find a quicker way to the East Indies, to Indonesia specifically. And he chanced upon this new land and sailed up the Hudson River, which now, of course, carries his name, and then reported back to his employers, and they started a colony there in a few years later called New Amsterdam, a part of New Netherland, which was, interesting enough, it is New Netherland without an S.
Okay.
So that is singular, which is this bigger area up to Albany and the surrounding area back to the south.
So this was in the 1600s or the 17th century. And you mentioned that there was the Dutch East India Company, and they were trying to get to Indonesia. So this company was it a private company?
It was a private company, and it started the trade with the East Indies, East India and India, Indonesia, and that whole area was started by the Portuguese. So the Portuguese in the 16th century did quite a brisk trade with those regions, and the Dutch took notice, and always quick to make some money. They thought, well, let's explore that area. So in the beginning, there were a lot of private people who outfitted boats and ships, and then went there, and then came back a very long time later, and then sold the goods, and then made money. And at some point, the state did say, this is not really a good idea. We need a monopoly. We need a monopoly. And then the East India Company was that monopoly. They were the only ones that could outfit ships and do commerce and trade with the East Indies. And so then it became an enterprise. It was the largest employer in Europe at the time. It was a multinational. And it attracted a lot of employees from surrounding countries, from Scandinavia, from Germany, from poorer places around. So that was really the start of this empire that was a colonizer.
And what were they trying to get? So
spices.
Spice, but what spices? Like cinnamon or, what?
Specifically cloves.
Cloves, okay.
And cloves, pepper, nutmeg. All these things brought in a ton of money for the people back home. And the trip would take a long time. It would go along the west coast of Africa, down, because there was no other way, down what is now South Africa, Cape de Good Hope, and then go up on the other side of Africa, and then start the treacherous journey across to the East Indies. And that's when they founded this kind of farms in South Africa and Cape de Good Hope as a refreshment station. So ships would go there, and they needed fresh water, they needed fresh food, and so they stayed there for a while and got all these things that they needed, provisions for the longer journey out east.
Now, you mentioned cloves and nutmeg. To me, these are kind of boring spices. I wouldn't I wouldn't go across the world to get some cloves. Why
there was money to be made. It was not, if it had been something else, they would have done that. It was all about money, of course.
And why was it so valuable? Just because it was rare or unavailable?
I guess that people back home and in Europe wanted that. They wanted, it was not only spices, it was also cloth from China and goods from China also. But when the ship would come back, it would be weighed and traded, and people would buy it and they would sell it on. There was just a ton of money in that. Yeah,
So I've heard people call the Dutch 17th century the Dutch Golden Age as well.
Yeah, that is now not a good term anymore. So when I grew up in school, of course, we learned about these great things that the Dutch did overseas and this big empire, little country, but a big empire. And of course, the truth and reality is quite different.
Right. I guess it's not a golden age if you're a colonial subject.
That's true. It's not a golden. It was not a golden age for the majority of people. And now also in museums, that term Gouden Eeuw, Golden Age, is removed and it's called the 17th century, a much more neutral term.
But it is true that at that time, the Dutch influence was felt throughout the world.
Yes, and that is true. And I owe a lot of my employment to the 17th century. All the students I get there's so many students, graduate students, who study the Atlantic world. Right. And the Atlantic world means you have to go to Dutch sources.
In fact, you teach a class called 17th Century Dutch Texts.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that class? How does it work? What do you do in that class, and who's taking that class?
So it really grew out of a summer course that I teach, which is a 3-week, sometimes 4-week intensive course specifically for graduate students. And it consists of 2 weeks of modern Dutch for reading purposes and 1 week of 17th century Dutch and paleography, which is handwritten source material, because handwritten texts in the 17th century are extremely difficult to read. I mean, normally you cannot read them. You need training to do so. And out of that, there is such a demand for something like that, because first of all, Dutch is not taught extensively in the United States. There's maybe 8 universities where you can take Dutch. And 17th century Dutch, that is even more elusive. And also in the Netherlands, it is now when you major in Dutch literature or linguistics, it is not a mandatory subject anymore for students to take, which it was in years past. And I read an interesting article in a newspaper the other day that there are fewer and fewer people who can read medieval texts, which is, again, totally different from 17th century handwriting, because they're not taught anymore. And there is just maybe a handful of people who can still read them. And the same will be true for 17th century texts. So it's very difficult to find a class for American graduate students who need to read these handwritten materials, because not everything is transcribed into printed texts. But then also the printed texts are very difficult to read.
Why is that? For
them, because the spelling is completely all over the place. There's no codified spelling in those days. One author in the same sentence could write a word totally different the second time. And the grammar is a little different. There's just differences that just like, I guess, when you study English from the 17th or 16th century, it's different.
It's hard, yeah.
It's hard. But still, students who study maybe slavery, the history of slavery, the Dutch played a big role in slave trade, but also commerce, right? Like we just talked about, Indonesia.
What text do you read in that class? Is it talking about we're ordering 500 pounds of spices, or is it, all colonial related, or are there other things?
There is art historical texts,
okay,
like manuals from painters that I use. on the art of painting. It could be historical texts. There are texts that are about just everyday things. I try to find a mix of text so that's interesting to everyone.
Can you talk a bit about maybe one of the texts in the class that...
So one text that I use, and that's a handwritten text, and I use that in that class because it is relatively easy to read. You have to get used to it, but it's relatively easy to read, also for me. If it gets more difficult, it's not. It's beyond me.
Right.
And it is part of a corpus that's commonly referred to as the prize papers. It's a corpus of documents, I think there's tens of thousands, that were captured in the 17th century by privateers or from ships, or by the English in one of the many Anglo-Dutch wars that we've had. And they were brought to England, and they ended up in archives, National Archives in London, and they sat there for quite a few centuries. And then someone started to look into them, and there is part of that, those prize papers, which are letters from wives or girlfriends to the husbands and boyfriends or friends or relatives on the ships who were working on ships going to the East Indies or anywhere else in the world. And the interesting thing about them is that most documents that you read from the period are written by people with power or people with money or maybe artists or literary people. But these are the voices of just a common 17th century woman, person.
Yeah.
And just people who are washerwomen or who had very lowly jobs. And normally you don't hear those voices. But because these have been preserved and they wrote those letters to their loved ones, and the topics are very mundane sometimes, and they follow a certain formula. Like it always starts with, I hope you are well, and were it different, it would pain me. And that's how it starts. It's just formulaic. And then it gives news from home. For instance, I regret to have to tell you that your mother died or your sister died and her children died because this was 1664 when these letters were taken, and so they never reached the loved one.
Oh, so it was like a mail.
Yeah, it was
shipment.
mail. Yes.
Oh, wow.
They were mail went on the ships to people, and it was also a year of plague in Amsterdam. So many people died of the plague, and those letters talk about that. I'm sorry to tell you that so and so has died, and this has happened, and just general, also just news from home.
So it really is like a snapshot.
It's a snapshot.
If you were to grab a mail truck today and put it away for 350 years, and then look at it, it would tell you a lot about what's going on in this.
Yeah, about just regular people, who just had a little place to live, and they had their business, and they had their neighbors, and so it's news from these people that they wrote to other people.
When you think of the Dutch 17th century, you think of the East India Company, you think about ships, you think about these grand things, but in reality, there's people living within this political entity, and they're not living this life that you might imagine is trading spice and going all over the place. They're, taking care of the chickens, or they're going to the market or whatever. They're living just normal lives within this context. As a modern day American, as a living American, I feel like Americans today have a very strong identification and sense of continuity with people who lived in 1776. There's a real sense of an unbroken chain from like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, these founding fathers, to today. These characters exist with us right now. You turn around the corner and you might imagine that you'll see Ben Franklin there with a kite living today. Our sense of self is rooted in that period of time, I think. I'm wondering, as a Dutch person, do you feel a sense of continuity with the Dutch 17th century, or is it like a totally foreign historical period doesn't have any impact or influence on the way you think of yourself?
It's interesting because here in this country, when you think of Jefferson and Washington, these cannot be the direct ancestors of the majority of people living here, right? Like, for instance, I think your family is German originally.
Yep. So
they
Italian
are not,
and German,
yes, Italian, German. So there's a very different sense of belonging or nationality here. You're American.
Right.
And I'm American.
Yes.
But I don't think that I have a direct relation with Washington or Jefferson. Maybe it's different when you are born here and grow up here and learn about these people in school. But even then, there is no personal connection because there cannot be.
Right.
They are from a totally different part of the world, and your family is from a totally, like most families here, most people are from a totally different part of the world. Whereas in the Netherlands, European countries in general, they could be. Rembrandt could be my ancestor. He's not. But theoretically, he could be.
But you know that you are the descendant of somebody who was living as part of that.
That's
world.
true. Yes. Yeah. It's funny because my mother at some point hired a genealogist to do her family tree, and it turned out that her family is from the islands in the north of the Netherlands, and lots of her ancestors were lighthouse keepers or fishermen or something to do with the sea, right? So, and it went back, there's written statements that the things that he found to like the 1400s, and with a name from baptism records and stuff like that. So I thought that was pretty cool. But do I feel a personal connection to that 14th, this person who lived in the 1400s? Not really. It's more of an interest. Okay, so that is an ancestor, but so far away.
Right.
That's
Gotcha. Okay, so the Netherlands was this great power in the 17th century. But what is the status of Dutch today, the Dutch language and the sense of feeling Dutch, if people are feeling a sense of pride about that? Or, what is the modern day Dutch identity, I guess?
So when I talk about the language, I almost feel that it is as if maybe people in the Netherlands, I'm not speaking about Flanders now because I think it's quite different there, but they don't really feel that it is important to speak Dutch, or it's important to learn Dutch for people who grew up with other languages. For students, when my students go to the Netherlands and they are so proud and eager to practice their Dutch, what I always get from them immediately, it was impossible to speak Dutch. Because people immediately, you open your mouth and they switch to English. Not because they just want to accommodate you. They say, you don't have to speak Dutch because we speak English. It makes it easier for you. But of course, the point for the students is, we want to speak Dutch. It was actually to such an extent, this is such a problem, a universal problem in the Netherlands for people trying to practice the language, that the Taalunie, the regulatory language body, made buttons that said in Dutch, speak only Dutch with me.
Oh, wow.
And they gave that to students and said, wear that so people speak on my. That didn't really help.
That doesn't help. You can't just point to the button and say, hey.
Yeah. So, and also, this was totally not true in my time, but I would say it's a trend within the last maybe 10 years, maybe a little longer, that first all graduate studies in the Netherlands were taught in English.
Yeah.
And now it's even undergrad is very often in English to a ludicrous extent. Because Dutch professors might speak English very well, but not maybe well enough to differentiate between very subtle differences or subtle concepts in the topics they are teaching. You need to know the language so well to be able to explain or to talk about very subtle differences in concepts. They're not equipped to do that. And students complain about it.
Yeah.
And it's just like almost like it is a dumbing down of whatever topic you're studying because of the language.
Right.
And you have a language barrier, and this is the opposite almost, So it's also a barrier, but more not because you don't understand the language, but not well enough to teach at a very high level or university topics. And I spoke to a student once in the Netherlands, and she said, I study, and whatever it was that she studied, I forget. But she said, I cannot talk to my parents about it because I don't have the Dutch words for it. I never learned them, the Dutch terms. So I cannot explain to my parents exactly what it is that I study.
So what you're saying really is English looms large in the Dutch linguistic picture.
Mm-hmm. American English specifically now.
American English. And so it's happening that some people are learning certain registers of the language. They're learning to talk about certain concepts that they don't really know the Dutch terms for or the Dutch way of using it. And these are native speakers of Dutch.
Yes.
Does it ever happen that two Dutch people who are natively speaking Dutch will speak English with each other for any reason?
No, I don't think so. No, thank God. It's not that bad yet. So, no, and there's always in the newspapers and media, there's always the question, will Dutch disappear? And then experts, some say yes, some say no. And I personally think that the language will not disappear because people will speak Dutch continuously.
Yeah.
But it is not a good sign that English has such a big influence. It's also in words, in new words, you always take the English term. You would never make a Dutch term out of it. And that's also different probably in Southern Dutch, Flemish. They're better at finding a Dutch term for it. It's a bit laziness also, I think. Just take the Dutch English term. I do it myself too. It's so easy.
What accounts for this difference between Southern Dutch and Northern Dutch, where Southern Dutch is more wanting to hold on to the use of the language and police its boundaries? I
think it is because in Belgium there's always been such a struggle between French and the dominant, which was the dominant language for so long, and Dutch. And Dutch was, at some point, the language in schools had to be French, and you were not supposed to speak Dutch at all. The dominance of French was so large that people felt oppressed in using in their identity. And as we know, language is such a big part of identity that they felt threatened in their right to exist and the right to use their language. And I think that's why they are much more maybe proud of the language and also do more and are more eager to preserve it.
And also they have more practice in making sure that it is not encroached upon by other hegemonic languages.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah.
In policy and other things. Yeah.
So you feel that Dutch will continue to be spoken. Another question I have regarding your students. So if they study with you and then they go to the Netherlands and everybody speaks English with them and they want to speak Dutch, but maybe they're not able to get to speak Dutch, what are they missing out on, if anything, just by speaking English with people? Or is there a sense in which English is used as a barrier to prevent people from coming in to a certain extent, or not really?
No, not really. I think the reason people speak English with people who try to speak Dutch is to make it just easier for them. And it's just Dutch. It's not important. We will speak English because we speak English and it makes it easier for you. So I think it's more that. Another thing about language or speaking language, you can live in the Netherlands very well without knowing Dutch for your whole life.
Wow.
Because everybody to some extent speaks English. But what you miss out on, if you do that, I know people who live in the Netherlands and have been there for a long time but don't speak Dutch at all because they don't need to.
Right.
But you do miss out on a big part of society
What do you miss out on?
You miss out on the political discourse, culture, things that are in Dutch, theater, things people talk about, when you are in a cafe and you're with your own friends, you speak English with them, but around you, you hear other conversations, right? And to be part of a community, you don't listen to these conversations per se, you're not interested in them, but they're there. And you're part of a bigger community when you speak Dutch and can understand it. Even though you don't need it for your day-to-day needs or for anything, really. But there's the bigger picture, the newspapers. So there's a whole conversation maybe in the country that you miss out on because nobody bothered to put it in, translate it to you in English.
Right.
Like on page 4 in a newspaper, there's a whole thing about Museum X. And if you had known the language, you would have said, hey, that's a very interesting exhibit. I would love to go there and talk to my Dutch friends about that exhibit. But you can't because you don't know about it. So you do miss out on being a member of the community. You're not a member. You're still an outsider.
Are there Americans or people from other countries living in the Netherlands who learn Dutch? And what is their status?
Yes.
Are they because from what you've described, it's relatively unusual for somebody to learn Dutch and then use it.
Well, there's of course there's many immigrants from many countries, and in order to participate in society, they need to learn Dutch. For instance, when you talk about refugees, for instance, they need to learn Dutch in order to get better jobs, maybe, because otherwise you'll just do manual labor. You don't need to speak Dutch for it. So it is important for that reason too, to speak the language. So, but I know quite a few Americans who live in the Netherlands and their English is just very, very good. Their Dutch, is very good. Almost native. You hear a little accent, but that's it. So,
and are they able to be integrated in speaking Dutch with other Dutch speakers, or are they looked down upon?
No, not at all. No, not at all. On the contrary, people are amazed that you want to learn Dutch and then that you do it to such a great extent and that you speak so well. But I think for especially Americans moving to the Netherlands, when you have a family or kids that go to Dutch schools, you have to know Dutch in order to talk with your children about school subjects or,
Gotcha. So those Americans who never learn Dutch and who live for 20 years speaking only English.
Yeah, or not only Americans.
Or other people. So my question is, if you were still, if you never came to the U.S. and you were living in Amsterdam still, and you had a friend who was from America, who lived by you and never bothered to learn Dutch, what would you think about that? Would you be like, oh, that's normal? Or would you think, what's wrong with this person? Why aren't they bothering to learn Dutch?
I would probably think that it's a missed opportunity. It would enhance their experience, but I would continue to speak English with them and have no problem. I would not judge that person, I think. I would just think, if I were you, I would want to know the language because I want to fully participate in society.
Right. As that person moves through their daily life, speaking English in a shop, speaking English in a cafe, speaking English in an office, is it considered rude in any way to just go up to somebody cold and start speaking English to them?
No, I don't think. Dutch people don't find things rude very quickly. On the contrary, other people think that Dutch people are rude.
Why is that?
Because Dutch people are known to be very blunt. They just say what they think, and they think, well, that's just honesty.
Well, your TA, who's actually from Belgium, the first thing he said to me was, listen, Chris, I'm very direct. I'm just going to tell you exactly what I think, and just so you know.
Yeah,
it was like
it's funny because Belgian people are the opposite. This is something that it's a gripe they have with the Dutch, the Northern Dutch, that they're so direct. Belgian people are not like that, but he is a little bit. He's very Dutch in a certain way. Yeah.
No, that's funny. Okay. Anything else?
No, I don't think so.
Wijnie, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate
It was a pleasure.
I really appreciate it. Hold on, let me do that again.
Okay. All right. Go for it.
Wijnie, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was a pleasure, Chris. Thank you.